Welcome to this plenary panel, Achieving 2030 Seabed Mapping Targets. My name is Charles Goddard. I'm Editorial Director at the Economist Group. It's really extraordinary to think that less than 20% of the seabed has been mapped. And I think equally extraordinary to contemplate how much work and effort, and some of that work and effort is now in progress, it will take to map the remaining 80%. And bridging that gap will be truly a Herculean undertaking. But why do we need to know more about the floor of the ocean? What difference will it make to what we're doing in the ocean? And just why is ocean mapping such an important part of understanding and managing the future of what covers 70% of our planet? So in building, and also in building particularly a sustainable ocean economy, which we focus on a lot at the World Ocean Summit. And what is needed indeed to mobilize governments, industry, academia, and investment to increase their support for seabed mapping. I'm joined today by four distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them. Jamie McMichael-Phillips, Project Director of Seabed 2030, the Global Mapping Initiative. Catherine Novelli, former Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment at the US State Department. Lowri Evans, and the former Director General of the Maritime Affairs and Fisheries Division of the European Commission, and Jyotika Virmani, who's Executive Director of the Schmidt Ocean Institute, which is a foundation. You will find the full biographies of our panelists on the screen under this media player. So let's jump in, shall we? And let's start with Jamie, and back to that figure that I mentioned earlier. A little over 20% of the oceans are mapped at this point in time, to which you paid a fairly important role. But it does seem extremely low, doesn't it? But I think before I sort of ask you how the remaining 80% is going to be done, I want to really see if I can understand or help our audience understand a little bit about how this mapping actually takes place. What kind of technologies are used, and how do you put it all together? I think it would be helpful for everybody to try and understand that briefly.
Thank you, Charles, and I'm delighted to have been asked that question and to be able to participate in this panel. Just by way of explanation, let me just explain the project. The full title is the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 project. We call it Seabed 2030 for short, but going back to that full title strikes at the very heart of what is a truly global collaboration. JEBCO is an acronym. It means many things, but it stands for the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean. And when I talk about bathymetry, I'm talking about depth information. And JEBCO is a project, a long-term project. It is also a group of people, and it is also a product. And it was an initiative that was started by Prince Albert I of Monaco back in 1903 to make available the most current information on the shape of the seabed. It was born in 1903, and it is now administered under the joint auspices of the International Hydrographic Organization based in Monaco and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission based in Paris. Now, the Nippon Foundation, as many will know, established in 1962, is one of the major philanthropic organizations operating in the field of marine conservation. They have a vision to pass on a healthy and bountiful ocean to the next generation, and part of their portfolio is to engage in capacity development projects across the world and to use and to engage a global network of individuals and organizations. Now, Nippon Foundation and JEBCO have a well-established relationship, and in 2017 they came together to look at how ocean mapping might support UN Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Underwater, and they launched the Seabed 2030 project. And Seabed 2030 has a mission to map 100% of the world's ocean floor by the year 2030 and make that available to everyone. Free to use, free to download. Now that's a tall challenge because, as you quite rightly pointed out, we've only got to 20% to date, and we have another a little over under 80% still to go before the end of the decade. 8 years, a little over 8 years to achieve that. Now, why is it taking so long? Well, there's a whole host of challenges, but before I tell you why it's taken so long, let me just explain why ocean mapping is important. 70% of our world is covered by water, yet we only know less than, or just a little over 20% of it. And that is a bit of an indictment as to the fact that we've gone out, we've been able to measure more about the surface of the moon, the surface of Mars, than our own planet. And of course, we're heading for a climate crisis. We have less than 10 years to reverse the impacts of climate change. And the oceans are fundamental to climate change and weather patterns. The movement of water masses around our oceans are affected by the shape and the roughness of the seabed. So actually those bodies of water that move about and drive our climate are affected by the shape of the seabed. So the more we know about the seabed, the more we can influence the prediction and the models that predict climate and climate change and weather patterns. Those same bodies of water have a direct impact on the cryosphere, the marine cryosphere, the interface between the oceans and ice, either in fjords or ice caps, Antarctica, the Arctic, and such like. And they affect the melting of those ice areas, which again have a direct impact on sea level rise. And therefore, we need to be able to predict better sea level rise. It's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, and how we mitigate against that and prepare ourselves for it. And there's so much more. Management of the oceans. I think it was Peter Drucker that said, if you can't manage what you don't measure. So how do we manage our oceans sustainably if we haven't measured them? How do we ensure safety of navigation? How do we ensure protection of ecosystems? Back in January, it was announced that a major reef was discovered off the coast of Tahiti. But the only way to discover things like that is to go out and to map the seabed, look at what is unusual or different, and investigate further. So all these things are reliant on a map of the ocean floor. So we've really got to get on and do it, and we've got to make that happen by 2030.
Jamie, thank you. That was fascinating. I didn't quite answer my question of actually how you do it, but I think it did answer many other questions about exactly why it is so important, particularly given the climate crisis that we face. And I think that's also something that I'm sure many people didn't quite appreciate, the connection between mapping the seafloor and understanding the extent of the climate crisis that faces us through sea level rise, particularly. Very quickly, Jamie, because I want to get on into the rest of the conversation, but very quickly, the question, how realistic is it? I mean, it's taken 120 years to get to 20%, and you've got to get eight years for the other 80%. How realistic is it really to get there, do you think?
Entirely, but it is going to take some global effort. And you touched on how do we do it? Well, to map the dry bits of the land, you can use a camera. It's easy, but the ocean, light doesn't penetrate particularly far, so we are stuck with using sonar. So we're stuck with the physics of propagating sound through the oceans, and that is a slow process. So that's why it's taken so long. But we've calculated that it's 200 ship years, one ship operating for 200 years to map the ocean floor by the end of the decade. If you do the maths, you can drive that down to 50 ships in the remaining 80 years. And those ships can be autonomous, they can be conventionally crewed, but they need to get on and do that, and that makes our mission entirely achievable if we can have the global community mobilize those 50 platforms.
Great. Okay, well, let's come back to how we can mobilize that global community in a second. But Catherine Novelli, can I come on to you? I mean, you have played an extraordinary role in the ocean, particularly during your stint at the State Department and building our ocean conference. Can I just ask you why you feel it's so essential that we map the seabed?
Well, Charles, I think because it's foundational. Just like everything else that we've done terrestrially, you need a map to figure out what you're going to do with these things. Not only how are you going to conserve them, which is vitally important, but how are you going to economically make use of the resources that are there. And now I think we have a newer concept that we have to do this in a sustainable way. And so this foundational piece has obviously not yet been accomplished, but yet we have a third of the world's population living within 100 kilometers of the ocean. We have 3 billion people depending on fish as their primary source of protein, and 237 million full-time jobs dedicated just to fisheries alone. So there's a lot of economic activity that needs to be and is going on with respect to the ocean already. And I think, if we want to preserve the ocean so that it can be a sustainable resource, we have to have a map so we know where we're going.
Can I just ask you to sort of comment too on what Jamie was saying about the importance of this endeavor to climate change? Because I know you're passionately involved, were in the whole Paris negotiations, and it seems to me that this is really quite the most fundamental thing right now for anything that we do in the ocean, is to sort of map out how we track our way out of this problem. And the Seabed Initiative is important to that, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, it's important because it's going to help us with the climate issue. It's important in its own right, and I think that often climate is in its own silo and ocean is in its own silo, and the connection between ocean and climate is not well recognized by the general public and folks outside of the ocean world. And so even when you mentioned Paris, even at Paris, we had to work really hard to even get a mention of the ocean in the Paris Agreement. And of course, that's gone beyond now, thank heavens, because the whole ecosystem is connected. We've got, 70% approximately of our oxygen comes from the ocean, and the ocean and mangroves, et cetera, have huge carbon sinks in them today. So all of these things are intertwined, and we can't really solve one without the other.
Well, let me just pick up, if I can, Lowri Evans, with your thoughts on this, because at the European Union, when you were part of the Maritime Affairs Bureau, I would argue that since then, ocean policy has been shaping in a slightly different way. We're looking at more kind of green, or rather blue growth policies in the European Union. We're looking at the Green Deal and the way in which the ocean economy and the sustainable ocean economy fits into that. How do you interpret what shape European policy is in at the moment regarding the ocean, and what do you see as the connection there between information science and particularly the Seabed Initiative?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I can build very easily on what Jamie and Kathy have just said. From an EU perspective, when I was working in maritime affairs and fisheries for a living, as it were, Charles, we were just getting interested in how the sustainable ocean economy could be built. But what has shifted in the last couple of years is, from a policymaker perspective, they're catching up with the scientific understanding that the ocean and climate change policy have to be one and the same. And this has been slow, I think, to be understood. At the EU level, it is understood now. And President von der Leyen has actually made the explicit link to the Green Deal only very recently, and she understands it now. But I would say from an EU policy perspective, there is quite a great deal more ambition to be had, and I would hope that the EU would lead that ambition internationally. I've had the pleasure recently, or the honour really, of sitting on an ocean mission board under the very able leadership of Pascal Lamy. And that is a call to arms for the EU, but I think it should go wider. And where the ocean science, ocean knowledge and seabed mapping fits in is basically as an enabler of much better joined up policy that can influence climate change and the sustainable ocean economy agendas. The seabed mapping data that Jamie is looking to complete is actually a proxy for other ocean knowledge which is equally incomplete. And if we don't have more urgency in tackling that, so 2030 is not so much an aspiration as a necessity, we won't be able to get much more effective joined-up policy that has much more impact, positive impact, on mitigating climate change effect, adapting climate change effect, and indeed building a properly sustainable ocean economy.
And the better to inform policy, as you're suggesting, science and information needs to be. And I'm completely with you here, because we've just been putting together a report on chemicals in the ocean, and there's very little joined up thinking around that. And in fact, the European Environment Agency has said that European waters are still nowhere near the targets that were set for those waters. Looking at that and your comment, and indeed sort of Kathy's comment, that essentially ocean policy is not really high enough on the agenda, on the global agenda. It's just got onto the COP climate negotiations. It's still not really high enough on the G7 and G20 agendas, despite the importance of the ocean. How do you think a project like this is going to, or an endeavor like this, and in the wider science endeavor, going to inspire us, in a sense, to get active about getting ocean back onto right at the top of global policy?
Okay, I think we need to dissect that a little bit. So if we think about ocean and water knowledge as one enabler for better policy, another enabler is more political and people engagement in these issues. I mean, arguably, it's not ocean science, ocean policy is not high enough on politicians' agendas because we haven't made enough effort to inform the public and make the public own these issues. And it really, this engagement, the citizen ownership aspect is necessary for a wider societal acceptance and understanding of the importance of this policy. And, where the people go, the politicians will follow. I think that's how it works in a democracy anyway. In an optimistic way, I think that there are very few top-level politicians who have understood this, but one of them is President Macron. And he has demonstrated that understanding very recently. And, my hope is that he will take this forward to the global international level. And the European Commission will do everything it can to help that. But we need to go not just into that agenda, but also into deliverables. I'm quite skeptical about conferences unless the promises are actually followed through by action and money. And, you might want to develop that, Charles.
I'm not sure it's quite the Economist place to sort of look for the money, but certainly I absolutely agree. Action-oriented events are what is needed now. I mean, Jyotika, Virmani, can I come to you and just sort of, and part of what Lowri was saying is that, we need to get people involved and inspired by what's there at the bottom of the ocean. And I know that the Schmidt Ocean Institute has found a number of fascinating things in the ocean. But can I ask you why would a foundation be interested in really supporting this mapping?
That's a really good question, Charles. And thank you, first of all, for inviting me here to discuss SEBA 2030 and the importance of seafloor mapping. So I think there are at least three reasons that philanthropy is involved and the role that philanthropy can play in this venture. And, as Jamie said, this is truly a partnership. It has to be a global effort. So the Schmidt Ocean Institute, was founded in 2009 by Eric and Wendy Schmidt to advance the frontiers of ocean exploration and research through technological advancement and intelligent observation and very critically, the open sharing of information. So as a philanthropic organization, we can take risks unlike some governments, and we don't need to make a profit. So, like industry may have to. So that means that we can support new technology development, and we can also fund scientific research, and in this case, things like seafloor mapping, globally that doesn't necessarily fit into a single country or a country's portfolio or a company's agenda or mission. So that's one way. Another way, I think, and we do that, by the way, by providing a research vessel that's fully equipped with sonar equipment at no cost to scientists from around the world. And in exchange, we ask that they make that data quickly available and freely available. And the reason for making the data available quickly and freely is because the faster we know things, the faster we can respond. And we've just, gone through that with the coronavirus, and the speeding up of data and information has led to the most rapid development of vaccines. So that's one. The second way, I think, is that we're not constrained to any one country, so we can provide this asset to scientists from any country around the world, essentially, and we do that. So that's the second way that philanthropy can kind of step in. And then the third way is philanthropy can be very nimble, and it allows us to act very quickly when needed to characterize vulnerable habitats and to bring about that rapid information that has been alluded to for policy and management. And so, for example, we mapped Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument a few years ago, and that map has actually helped to expand the protection of that marine protected national monument. So a number of ways.
I know you've had some challenges too in trying to ensure that, or get the acceptance of countries to allow you to do the mapping when you're passing through their waters. When you do that, how do you actually talk to countries and tell them about the importance of this, and whether or not what you're doing can also help them and get them to make those agreements with you?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So we apply for permits to do scientific research, and we work with the scientists, the countries they're from. We contact and we work through the State Department in the US to make connections and to apply for those permits. And I think some of the things we run into is as we transit around the world from country to country, we have this incredibly valuable asset. And, as Jamie said, we need these ships out there. They are out there, but there are some places that won't give us permission to just simply map the seafloor as we transit through, and to then give that data to this global public database. And which they would then also have knowledge of their own marine, real estate, essentially. So I think we're wasting this asset as we transit through different national territorial boundaries. And then other countries don't actually have the ability to process permits yet. And so I think sometimes they see, the application and they're like, well, it's not for us to consider, it's for this other department, or we don't know what to do with it. And so sometimes the first response is no, and then that takes a lot more effort, and it can take 6 months to 18 months to get a permit in place. I mean, this is not a very quick and easy process, which I think in this day of technology, we should somehow be able to work out a way that makes it uniform and easier to process for the common good.
Indeed, I'm not going to ask you which countries are refusing to do it. Jamie, can I come back to you? One of the things that you mentioned is this need to focus efforts on the most productive work, in other words, to prioritize things. And I believe you did a survey of a number of stakeholders on what the priorities should be for seabed mapping, and I'm not sure at what stage that is. But would you talk a little bit about, if you can, what some of those survey results were telling you, and what do you think the priorities now need to be as you look at that 80%, and why are you making choices around those priorities?
Okay, yeah, lots of moving parts here. We launched back in 2020 a survey, an online survey, which was to reach out to stakeholders across the entire global community to ask about their views on which parts of the ocean they felt should be mapped and why, and what was important to them. And we did a first cut in 2020. We relaunched it again at the end of 2020 and into 2021, and we ended up with 800 stakeholder responses across 90 countries. Huge bunch of answers, rich, thoughtful answers. And we're now taking that, and as you can imagine, that's a pretty enormous task, because everybody has a different perspective on a patch of ocean as to why that ocean is important to them. And we're now distilling that, and the aim is to determine the socioeconomic benefits for mapping areas of the ocean, to then divide the ocean up into manageable chunks, so that we can advertise those, and with the aim that they will attract the attention of individuals who are deeply interested in those parts of the ocean and can achieve funding to map those. Now, that sounds like an easy task, and I've described it at a very high level. We're still working through the results. We're working through that in internal workshops, and then we need to reach out to the entire global community, all those who have a stake in the oceans and management of the oceans, to validate our results, because inevitably we're looking at it from one end of the telescope, and others need to be involved and need to have their say, and then we can go live and advertise that, and that, I hope, will inspire and attract the attention of individuals, politicians, financiers, scientists, to look at those areas with a broader perspective and get on and help us map them.
I mean, one question that comes to mind for me, and it's just playing the devil's advocate really, is does that approach raise any potential conflicts of interest that you see for those that, have potential commercial interests in the ocean and those who want to provide mapping for the benefit of mankind? Is that a challenge that you see in this approach? And I'd love to hear what other people here say as well. I see Catherine nodding her head, but Jamie, quickly, if I can ask you that, and then come to Catherine.
Of course, there will be tensions. Everybody's got a different perspective on why a part of the ocean needs to be mapped, and as Jyotika has alluded to, some countries, often the answer to get in and map areas, the easy answer is no, because people don't understand that we're talking about one ocean here. So what happens in a remote part of the Southwest Pacific will undoubtedly affect people living in the other hemisphere in the North Atlantic, because the oceans are joined up, and ocean currents affect us all. So I think we've got to try and overcome those tensions. We've got to make available ocean mapping data for everybody to use in what way they see fit, so we level the playing field.
Catherine, can I come to you? How do you feel about that?
Well, I agree with everything that Jamie said. I also think that the reality is the ocean is a resource. And sometimes I think people look at it and say, okay, our only goal here is to conserve this resource and not use it. And in fact, the resource is going to get used. It has been being used since the beginning of man, and it's going to continue to get used. And so to me, part of the question is, how do you use it in a sustainable way? And that's why the mapping is so important, because it really is the foundation of what you have there, and everything flows from that kind of upwards. And so to me, there isn't an inherent conflict. The conflict is what people do when they get that data, and how do they use it, and what choices are made. But I think if we have a map, it helps us to make much better choices and gives us transparency into what the effects are of that use.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I can see both Lowri and Jyotika sort of nodding as well. And I would like to give you an opportunity just to sort of add your thoughts into there. Lowri, and then Jyotika. Lowri.
Yeah, just a quick comment on a slightly different angle. So certainly, I don't see a conflict either. to answer the question directly. So making the data available and then aggregating that data is good however it happens. And I think that what I'd like to inject into the discussion is the how. How do we aggregate that data? Not just the sea mapping data, but other ocean data. And I think we need to find ways to simplify that and to simplify how we make that available to as many people as possible, and not just scientists. So there are initiatives afoot to create digital twins of the ocean, which is a way to aggregate data, but also to project the known data into unknowns in a way. And how we all make that available to people who can work with that data is an issue in itself. So I think there's also a role in the public space for managing that data. You know, it should be available to everybody in a garage to produce value-added services or other insights into. And how you manage this huge volume of data is another public interest discussion to have. So, you know, making all of that mapping data to everybody with all of the other ocean knowledge to get an aggregate as good and improving picture as possible of how the ocean works in our planet. Those are huge issues. So I think going digital, using data in a really innovative way is part of this agenda. I'd love to hear Jamie's reaction to that after Jyotika has said her views.
Yeah, I think that's right. We would like to hear that as well, because I mean there are a number of initiatives, and the UN Decade of Ocean Science is one of them that's looking at this question: how do you draw this data together? But Jyotika, your thoughts both on both questions, whichever you choose.
Yeah, actually, I do. I very much agree with everyone, Jamie, Catherine, and Lowri. But I think just picking up on some of the things that were said, at the moment, 95% of coastal nations don't really have the ability to explore their own waters. And that's really problematic, not only for those nations to understand and manage their own resources, and that, you know, the management is critical to this, but also for understanding that connectivity that Jamie's alluded to from nation to nation. So just think about 95% of countries cannot yet gather this data, and that's a huge challenge right there. But it's also, I think, the concern is to use that seafloor or the ocean without knowing what else is out there. And this goes back to something Lowri said, which is it's not just the seafloor, but there's also a lot on biodiversity that we don't yet know. And what we do know from the limited amount of exploration that we have managed to do, are that there are cures for diseases that we have, amongst humans. And so who knows what else is out there? And the real concern is we destroy something that we critically need without even knowing it's there in the first place.
Can I, Jamie, I don't know whether you want to respond to any of those thoughts from Catherine, Lowri and Jyotika, but do you want to briefly respond to them? Because I want to also ask, and I want to also ask everybody, if I can, this question about, you know, how do we influence politicians and other decision makers at this point in time, whether they be in government or whether they be in industry or elsewhere, you really to recognize and invest in this ocean seabed mapping. How do we do that? What is actually the best approach to that? And perhaps, I mean, Jamie, if you want to just pick up on the last thoughts very quickly and then answer that question, I'll come to Catherine afterwards.
Yeah. I think aggregation of data is absolutely key here. I mean, why do we want to map the ocean floor? Well, I've touched on some of the science, but at the end of the day, it's providing a base map. It's providing a reference frame. You wouldn't build a city on an area that you haven't mapped. You wouldn't build a house in a field that you hadn't mapped. But we are operating in our oceans, across our oceans. We're using our ocean resources, but we haven't mapped our oceans. So I think we need to use that map as the base for all the other data aggregation, whether that's science whether that's protection of marine resources, whether that's discovery of new marine resources. So the base map is fundamental to data aggregation, quite simply. I think, how do we attract the attention of politicians and individuals? I think, and this is not a field of my direct expertise, but I think this is where the economics come in, and the connection of our ocean and the fundamental importance of our ocean to the blue economy. And, you know, the figures are already published. $24 trillion US is the estimated value of the blue economy, but you can drill down into that. And I know the Australian government have sponsored a study back in 2018, 2019 that looked at the value add of improving the mapping of their sea areas, whether that's to increase port knowledge. You know, they reckon that would be in the region of about 300 million Australian dollars value added if they could increase and have accurate knowledge of their ports. The same for search and rescue. If they can provide better safety and navigation for safe search and rescue operations, that is 250 million Australian dollars value added, and so on and so forth. Now, that is one country. But we need to extrapolate that across the whole of the ocean space, because the blue economy doesn't stop at country boundaries. It doesn't stop at marine boundaries. They are theoretical. They don't exist in physically, and the oceans are joined up, and we need to bear that in mind in all the economics that we do around the ocean space.
Thank you. Catherine, it's going to be difficult to get to 100% by 2030. Is it the best way to do so through the wallets and through the appeals to the economic incentives as well as the economic arguments that's going to help?
Well, I think that you need a combination of things. And, you know, when we started the Our Ocean conferences, one of the things that I think was really important was combining capturing the imagination, killer economics, and mission. And for the capturing the imagination, 70% of the planet is the ocean, and we've got 70% of that which we don't know anything about. It's the last great frontier. And people are explorers, and they have been forever. And I think it's important to get that component in there. That's sort of the going to the emotional side. On the killer economic side, we've already talked about how important the blue economy is and how foundational this is to that. So I think there's clearly that whole finance side, the finance ministries, et cetera, looking at that. And then lastly, it's also about saving the planet, and that's mission. And we all have an interest in that. And I think we finally have catalyzed the interest in that. It's taken a long time. And I think that it's putting those things together that compels people to want to do more. And that's, to me, the way to make a message.
Lowri, are those the kind of messages that would get through to European policymakers, investors, businesses, do you think?
I think I'm a little bit more skeptical about the economics of it, even though economics is my heart and my brain, because the economic arguments talk to territorial waters more than they talk to the high seas, really. And so there's a limit to how much politicians will be listening to that, I think. So I would concentrate on the emotional deficit in the discussions and how one can improve the engagement dimension. And I think practically that means that the scientists should be taking ownership and caring about people being involved and understanding what it is they want to do and why it's important. And then we have two dimensions that are in greater public consciousness than the ocean issues in general. And that one would be ocean plastics in the ocean, because of David Attenborough, I think. And that's a hook for a lot of people understanding more about the ocean, and we should shamelessly go there. And then the other dimension, to pick up on Jyotika's point, the coastal, the many countries with many coasts that are unmapped. Arguably, we need to do that in a citizen-engaged, citizen science way, because that would be hitting two enablers of better policy in one go. But it's more messy, and it's not so pure.
Yeah. There's clearly going to be a lot of different kinds of approaches that are needed. But Jyotika, can I just ask you to sort of round us out there, and as we finish this, and just what would you say are the kind of things that would influence others to get engaged in investing in this extraordinary idea?
I think actually one thing that we've not really touched on is the technology and how technology is evolving, and with autonomous and uncrewed technologies that are now coming online. There's seaked, there's sail drone, there's a few that are now online, and that makes the economics actually cheaper. So whatever number we're facing now this year, as technology evolves, will reduce in cost. And so I really am hopeful that we will get, quite a long way by 2030 through the combined uses of technology as well as the vessels at sea.
Well, thank you very much to everybody. I mean, I think all of us who are passionate about the ocean hope that this process can be accelerated, and hope that there are investors out there to invest in it, because clearly the seabed is a really important thing for us to understand and to map. And I would like to thank all of our panelists, Jamie McMichael-Phillips from Seabed 2030, Catherine Novelli, former US Undersecretary for State, Lowri Evans, formerly from the Maritime and Affairs and Fisheries Division for the European Commission, and Jyotika Virmani, who's with Schmidt Ocean Institute. Thank you all very much indeed.